On the 13th morning, she stood in the Duke of Ashverne's empty stable yard and felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she could breathe. The cold came up through the stones before the sun did. No hooves shifting, no breath fogging the dark. Every stall door stood open, and every stall stood bare. And Elara Voss stood in the center of all that emptiness, with a lantern in one gloved hand, perfectly still. She was not afraid. She was not even surprised. She had known, to the hour, that this morning was coming, because she was the one who had made it come. But to understand why a woman who had spent 2 years being invisible chose the most visible act of her life, I need to take you back to the morning the Duke of Ashverne opened his mouth and destroyed her future in exactly 9 words. You'll see exactly how she got to that courtyard, every step of it, every calculated move. But first, if you're new here, this is the channel where women like Elara get the endings they were promised and never given. Subscribe, and let me let you in. Now, let me take you back to the morning when the Duke said 9 words, and Elara Voss quietly began to count to 12. Her name was Elara Voss. She was 26 years old, and she had grown up inside the walls of Ashverne Park without ever once being of it, the steward's daughter, raised in the gap between the family and the help, fluent in both languages and claimed by neither. She knew which floorboards in the east wing creaked under a careless step. She knew the cook's name and the cook's mother's name, and she knew the Ashverne ledgers, the way other women knew scripture, every column, every debt, every quiet correction, because for 2 years, she had been the one keeping them. Her father had done the work before her until 18 months ago, when his heart had simply stopped one evening over his supper, and the estate had gone on as if nothing structural had shifted at all. Elara had not been dismissed. She had also never been appointed. She had simply continued, the work undisturbed, the title never offered, the stipend, her father's reduced stipend, paid to a name that, on paper, no longer held any post at all. If the Duke decided tomorrow to replace her with a man half as capable, she would have no contract to point to and no recourse to claim. She knew this. She had decided, with some discipline, not to think about it more than once a day. What she wanted was simple enough to fit in a single sentence, which was, she sometimes thought, exactly why no one had bothered to give it to her. Her name on the appointment, in ink, with a wage that matched the work she actually did. Underneath that wanting sat something she rarely let herself examine too closely. She wanted someone, anyone, to look at 3 consecutive years of an estate's solvency and say, correctly, that it was hers. What frightened her was not failure. She had never failed at anything Ashverne had asked of her. What frightened her was the quieter possibility that competence might simply not be the kind of currency that mattered, that no matter how flawless her work, a man with the right name could walk through the door tomorrow, and she would vanish from the accounting of her own labor as though she had never touched it. She carried herself the way she kept her books, every move several moves ahead of the one she was making. She was rarely surprised because she had usually already imagined the thing that was about to surprise everyone else. Every morning before the house woke, she sat at her father's old writing desk and corrected the previous day's entries in pencil before she inked them over. She told herself this was for accuracy. It was not, entirely. It was proof that she had been here, that she had done this, that someone, someday, opening these books, would know. And then, at a dinner she was not invited to attend, a man she had kept solvent for 2 years was asked by his own assembled guests, who managed Ashverne's accounts, and the Duke of Ashverne said he did not immediately recall. His name was Adrian Calder Ashverne, 6th Duke of the same, 32 years old, tall and reserved, carrying the particular coldness that settles into men who were admired long before anyone troubled to know them. He held the largest private landholding in Wiltshire. 3 tenant villages answered to him. When he spoke in the House of Lords, men listened, not because he spoke often, but because when he did, it was clear he was not guessing. He could make a man's career with a letter. He could end one with silence. He managed people the way he managed property, by inventory. What a thing was worth, what it produced, what it cost to keep. He had never once asked Elara what she wanted, because he had never imagined that what she had might not be what she required. She had never complained, and so he had read her silence as contentment, the way a man reads a quiet field and assumes it is simply resting. What he did not know, what he had not admitted even to himself, was that he read every ledger she produced, not for the figures. He read them at night, alone, because her notations, precise and occasionally dry, sometimes wry about a tenant's overdue rent or a tradesman's inflated invoice, were the most honest conversation he had in any given week. He did not know what to do with that, so he did nothing with it at all. The audience first meets him not face to face, but through the description Elara carried home with her, from a dinner she had not been asked to attend. The night a guest pressed him on who, precisely, kept Ashverne's books so well. We see him as she imagined him in that moment, unhurried, faintly surprised that the question had been pressed at all. "The accounts are managed in-house," he said. "I'll have the name sent round. Not cruel, possibly worse than cruel, indifferent." It was the year 1815. The war had only just ended, and money was moving again across England the way blood returns to a limb gone numb, painfully, unevenly, in fits. Men who had spent a decade at battle were coming home to estates in every state of disorder. Ashverne's estate was not disordered. It was, in fact, exceptional. People had begun to notice this and to ask, quietly, why. A woman in Elara's position held no professional title and no recognized standing anywhere a dispute might require one. Her word against a gentleman's was not a contest. It was barely a conversation. She could not engage a solicitor without a man's sponsorship. She could not advertise her own competence in company, because a woman who did so was not admired for it. She was called aggressive, unfeminine, finished. The only power she held moved through her work invisibly, precisely because the work was hers and no one else's name was attached to it. If she lost her position, she lost everything tied to it, her income, and the cottage that came with the role she did not officially hold, and the last visible trace of her father's 20 years of service. Adrian, for his part, had one vanity in the world, and it stood in his stables: 15 thoroughbreds, 3 matched carriage pairs, 2 stallions imported from Newmarket at considerable expense and greater pride. The ledgers were his discipline, the horses were his reputation. Strip them away, and he was simply a well-managed estate, admirable, forgettable, uncoveted. Every exchange between them obeyed a gap that neither of them ever named aloud. She called him Your Grace. He called her Miss Voss when he remembered to address her directly, and the ledger-keeper when he spoke of her to anyone else. It was not cruelty, it was architecture, built over generations, load-bearing, invisible to the people who had never had to live underneath it. And architecture, Elara had begun to understand, could be dismantled, provided you understood precisely how it had been built. What made their collision inevitable was not the dinner, and not the 9 words. It was the letter Elara found 3 weeks later, folded inside the estate's quarterly contract review, that proved the Duke of Ashverne had known exactly who she was all along. The account room sat at the rear of the house, lit by a wide east window, and a week after the dinner she had not attended, Elara was there as she always was, ruling fresh columns into the ledger, with the particular care she gave to anything that would outlast the day she made it. She did not hear him come in. He did not knock. It was, after all, his house. He brought a solicitor with him, a narrow man named Mr. Ferrers, who carried a leather case and looked at Elara the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been placed somewhere slightly wrong, noticeable, faintly irritating, not worth mentioning directly. She did not stand. Everyone in this house stood when the Duke entered a room. She looked up from the ledger, set her pen down in the groove of the standish with a care that was almost insolent in its calm, and met his eyes with the particular expression of a woman deciding whether to explain something slowly. He was not accustomed to being assessed. It showed, briefly, in the half-second before he composed his face again. She noticed, in the light through the east window, that he looked tired in a way she had not seen in him before. Not the tiredness of travel, but something older, something that had been accumulating for longer than the journey from London. She filed the observation away with the same neutrality she gave everything else in this room, and it cost her more than she expected to treat it as simply another piece of data. Adrian spoke to Ferrers about the accounts as though Elara might produce whatever was needed on request, without quite requiring consultation in the asking. She produced every document before the request had finished being made. Ferrers grew visibly uncomfortable with the rhythm of it. Adrian began, for the first time, to watch her in a different register altogether, not as furniture, not quite yet as a person, but as something he had clearly misfiled. At the end of the review, as Ferrers packed his case, Adrian turned to her. "The appointment will be formalized by the end of the month, Miss Voss," he said, with the flat politeness of a man noting a correction in a ledger. "You should have a contract." "I have been here 2 years, Your Grace," she said. "Just that. Just the information. Offered cleanly, without heat." He had no answer, because she was not wrong, and he knew it. Mr. Ferrars wrote in his notes that evening that the Duke of Ashverne's ledger-keeper was either the most capable woman he had met in 20 years of practice, or the most dangerous one, and that he was not entirely certain those were different things. The contract arrived 6 days later, and it was wrong in ways that mattered. It named her father's old title, estate steward, assistant, at her father's old rate, and buried in the third paragraph was a clause granting the Duke the right to end the arrangement on 14 days' notice. No cause required. She had been promised formalization. What she had been handed instead was precarity, notarized. It left her with no clean choice. Sign, and she was bound to terms worse than the informal arrangement she already endured. Refuse, and she had no position at all. Her savings, careful and thin after 2 years of underpayment, would carry her 4 months. No further. It told her something about him she had not let herself fully see before. He had not written this. Ferrars had, on his instruction, but Adrian had not read it before it left his desk. This was the pattern beneath the pattern. He delegated perfectly and reviewed nothing. The same quality that had let her name slip past him at a dinner table let a punitive contract pass under his signature unread. Not malice, absence, the particular kind of absence that power affords itself when it trusts the machinery below it to simply keep running. She had 12 days before the contract's acceptance window closed, and on the first morning, she sat down at her father's desk and began to read every document she had ever filed, looking for the thing she suspected the Duke of Ashverne did not know he had already given her. She found it on the 4th evening, cross-referencing files she had handled 100 times, without once truly reading them. A letter, 11 months old, addressed to Adrian from his own solicitor in London, recommending in plain professional language that the estate's account management be formally restructured around the woman already administering it, with exceptional competence, whose work the solicitor understood to be without peer in the county. The recommendation named her, it proposed a senior title, it proposed proper compensation, and in the upper corner, in his own hand, were Adrian's initials. He had read it. He had been told, in the clearest terms a solicitor could put to paper, exactly who she was and exactly what she was owed, 11 months ago, and he had done nothing. The dinner where he failed to recall her name stopped being incompetence in that instant. It became a choice. He had known and chosen, repeatedly, not to act on the knowing. She set the letter back in its file, in its proper order, and did not touch it again, because she had just understood that she did not need to take anything that was not already hers to take. There is a single, short break here, because I want to sit with you in that moment before the story moves on. She had just found the proof that he knew, and chosen silence anyway, and something in her had gone very still and very clear. That kind of clarity doesn't shout, it plans. And what she planned next is the reason you're still listening. The pressures came in threes, the way they often do. First, public. At a county gathering 4 days before her deadline, with Adrian away in London, a neighboring landowner named Lord Pemsley asked her directly who had authorized the recent drainage improvements on the North Field. She told him she had recommended them and overseen their execution herself. He laughed, not unkindly, just with the comfortable dismissal of a man who found the idea faintly absurd, and said, "Surely you mean you passed the recommendation on." The room watched to see what she would do. "Surely I do," she said, and smiled, and wrote the exchange into her private record that night, word for word. Second, financial. The solicitor's young assistant, who trusted her because she had spent 2 years quietly correcting his arithmetic, let slip that if she did not sign the offered contract before the window closed, the estate held the legal right to reclaim the steward's cottage. She would lose her income and her home in the same stroke. Third, and somehow the sharpest, came from Adrian himself, without his ever meaning it as cruelty. He returned from London and, in front of 2 tenants she had worked beside for years, handed Ferrars a letter thanking him for an excellent account review, work that was entirely hers, credited entirely to a man who had merely read it. She watched it happen. She did not react. She counted to 12. That evening, she found the thing that turned impossible into merely difficult, buried in the estate's historical property transfer documents. The same drawer that held the horse ownership records she filed every quarter sat a clause from the original Ashverne entailment of 1762, allowing for the transfer of livestock to a named estate manager in the event of a contractual dispute. It had never once been invoked. It had also never expired. She read the clause 4 times, then folded it inside her cloak, walked back to the cottage, and began to write 15 letters, each one addressed to a different stable in 3 counties. On the second narrator break, I won't tell you yet what was in those letters. I'll only say this. When a woman who thinks in systems finally runs out of patience with the system, she doesn't break it, she redirects it. Watch what happens next. On the 11th evening, one day before her window closed, Adrian came to the account room himself, without Ferrers, without warning. He carried a letter, not the solicitor's recommendation she had already found, but a different one entirely, one he had written himself 11 months earlier and never sent. It formalized her appointment at a senior rate. It gave her the title of head estate manager, and in its final paragraph, in language more unguarded than anything he had ever put to paper, it thanked her by name for everything she had built. He had not sent it, he told her, because he had not known how to give it to her without acknowledging everything it implied, that he had watched her work for years and respected it completely, and that the gap between them was one he had no idea how to cross without humiliating them both by naming it aloud. She held the letter for a long time, and then she said the only thing that was left to say, "Your Grace, the horses left this morning." The account room held its lamplight, the way it always did in the evenings, low and gold against the ledgers. No Ferrers, no witnesses. Just the 2 of them standing and the unsent letter lying open on the table between them like something that had finally been allowed to breathe. "You wrote this 11 months ago," she said. He said yes, and you decided that not sending it was the kinder choice. He began to answer, something about her standing, about how the county would read it, about the difficulty of her position in a household where appearances did so much quiet damage, and she stopped him before he could finish building the sentence. "Your Grace, I have spent 2 years making this estate run. I have spent 2 years being thanked in the passive voice. I have spent 2 years having my name go unrecalled at dinners, having my work credited to men who only reviewed it, having my future folded into a contract designed to make me portable at 14 days' notice. And you held a letter that would have ended every part of that, and you chose not to send it, and you called the choosing protection." The room went very quiet. Outside, somewhere past the window, a single owl called once and was not answered. "I needed the work protected," she said. "I needed the title protected. I needed the roof over my head protected. I did not need you to protect me from being seen." She picked up the letter, folded it once along its old crease, and placed it inside the contract file, the same file that held every document she had ever produced for this estate. It belonged in the record, with everything else true about her. Then she waited. He did not defend himself. He reached for the contract, the bad one, Ferris's contract, the one that had started all of this, and without a word, he tore it once across the middle and set the 2 halves down on the table between them. "Tell me what the terms should be," he said. And Elara Voss, who had spent 12 days building a door out of an entailment clause and 15 letters to county stables, looked at the Duke of Ashverne and understood that the horses had already done their work, but that the question now was whether she wanted to come back through the door she had made. On the morning of the 13th day, the stable yard stood exactly as silent as it had at the very start of this story. But now you understand all of it. 15 thoroughbreds, 3 carriage pairs, 2 Newmarket stallions. Every one of them moved, legally, documentably, to named estates across 3 counties, through 15 letters and a clause written in 1762 that no one had thought to read in over 50 years. Adrian could not ride out. He could not hold the hunt he had already scheduled. He could not receive the 3 lords arriving specifically to admire the horses he no longer had. For the first time in living memory, Ashverne looked diminished, and he had spent the night understanding precisely what she was capable of when she stopped choosing to be invisible. She had not left. She was still at the desk, still in the cottage, the entailment clause and the unsent letter and the torn contract, all gathered in front of her like evidence in a case she had already won. She had simply shown him, beyond any room for argument, exactly what the estate looked like with her judgment removed from it. He did not send Ferrers. He came himself and sat down across from her, not in the chair of authority, but in the visitor's chair, the one guests used. He placed a single blank sheet of paper on the table between them. "You write the terms," he said. "I will sign them." She picked up her pen, and for the first time in 2 years, she wrote her own name at the top of a document and did not think about whether it would be remembered. The contract she wrote that afternoon gave her the title of head estate manager, a salary 3 times her old stipend, the cottage in perpetuity, and a clause requiring 30 days written notice from either party, with cause stated plainly. Adrian signed it without amendment. The horses came home within the week, all 15, both carriage pairs, both stallions, and Elara oversaw every return herself, because she had specified, in each of her 15 letters, that no horse would be released without her own countersignature. She did not feel triumphant in the way people imagine triumph feels. She felt steady, the way a person feels after finally setting down something heavy they had carried so long they had stopped noticing the weight, and only now, with empty arms, could measure how strong those arms had become from carrying it. Adrian did not transform overnight into an easy or demonstrative man. What changed was his attention. He read every contract now before he signed it. He used her name and company, without prompting. When Lord Pemsley asked, at the next gathering, who managed the Ashverne accounts, Adrian said, simply, "Miss Voss. She has done so for 3 years. I'd recommend you remember it." He was still formal. He had simply become precise. Mr. Ferrers remained retained by the estate, with no further part in Elara's arrangements. Lord Pemsley spoke to her first the next time they met, not warmly, but with the calculation of a man who now understood she was someone worth knowing. She understood the difference between the two, and it did not trouble her at all. Here is what this story is actually about. It is about a woman who did the work, and did it beautifully, and was invisible anyway, and who decided, after exactly 12 days, that invisibility had been a choice she was making on someone else's behalf, and not her own. She did not destroy anything. She moved it. She took the tools of the very system that had overlooked her, spoke them in the language that system already understood, and made the cost of her absence so legible that no confrontation could have said it more clearly. That is what it looks like when a woman who thinks in systems finally turns those systems toward herself. If this story sat with you, if you found yourself counting along with her, somewhere around 12, this is the channel where you come back every time you need reminding that women like Elara always existed. History simply never filed them properly. Subscribe, and I'll keep finding them for you. And if you've watched this far without subscribing, well, you've seen what Elara did when she was taken for granted. I'm just saying. On the 13th morning, she stood in the empty stable yard and felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she could breathe. That's the ending she wrote for herself. I hope you enjoyed watching her write it.